This week in our Qualitative Research Methods class, we're going to be talking about how to design your qualitative research study. Some of the information within this chapter and this week is really important to make sure you understand prior to beginning your research study. So if you have any questions on any of this material, please post it in the office hours, and that way I can answer and it can benefit all the students. But it is important that we do cover this stuff in a way that you do understand it. There are a number of learning objectives this week. We are evaluating the applicability of theory and the concepts. We're going to explain how the research progresses from your original idea within your research study. This is the importance of the blog this week, so that you can put down your ideas, you can get feedback, so we can facilitate an in-classroom discussion. So please be as specific as you can, and please, all students, ask your questions. If you don't understand what a student's saying, it's okay to say that. I want you to challenge each other. We're going to describe the importance of authentic literature in research with doing from peer-reviewed journals, empirically based. We want to give an example of a problem statement with researchable questions. We're going to talk about the process of operationally defining a concept. Examine how the technique of concept mapping, you will have a concept map to turn in. I think next week or the week after. Understand the importance of advanced planning before you begin any data collection process. This is true in any type of research study. Understand the 3 concurrent flows of action. Explain why the dissemination of research findings is important. And we're also going to look at how to analyze the design logic towards understanding the research, as well as recognizing why this research can fail and also why it can succeed. So in this chapter and in our discussion, we're going to be thinking about planning your research, what tools are needed, when and why and where. We're going to conceptualize your ideas. We're going to look at how to conduct our literature reviews and look at advanced design and the planning of your research. As you see when conducting any research, and especially within the social sciences, there are different purposes to this type of research. And one purpose that we're going to look at is finding patterns within the social science. And this is important, and this is one of the reasons that you really are looking at qualitative research, because we're looking at quality, we're looking in depth, we're not just looking at numbers here. So we recognize that there are no laws like the natural sciences, that social life has regular patterns that you are trying to identify. Patterns equal tendencies, how often it happens, and you're looking at expected actions and reactions. As you're looking for the meaning of the underlying reason for these various patterns, you're going to do this by examining, testing, and really refining your theory. Theory is necessary to understand the patterns, why they're occurring, when they're occurring, where they're occurring. Theory is a statement that will describe a phenomenon. You're looking for a testable proposition, your general applicability, and these theories are built on your concepts, which are the basic building blocks. The concepts that we're talking about in qualitative research, there really are the smaller components to your theory. They're symbolic, abstract, representative elements of objects, phenomenon, ideas. Your concepts are going to communicate your ideas. They're going to help you explain a broad generalization. The concepts are important because they're the foundation of communication and thought. They're found everywhere. They're used constantly, really without even realizing that you're using your concepts. There's two distinct parts to your concepts, and the first one is the symbolic element, like a word, a symbol, term, and others, so on. It's your second part is the associated definitional element, the meaning of honesty. Remember, we talked about this, that it's important, and I may have mentioned this in another class, so let me mention it again here. How important it is when we operationalize and conceptualize our ideas, because we want to make sure we're communicating the meaning of what we're talking about, so that within our research and with those that are reading it, they understand what's meant by a certain term that we use. Can be your concept, your parts of your concepts can be learned implicitly or explicitly. And it's important to understand the concept occurrence, as I was talking about, as within the definition. An unclear definition within your concept can really put a barrier within your research. So concepts rarely occur in isolation. They occur more as clusters or propositions. Proposition is the statements that make up your theories, and we want to ensure that our concepts have a testable proposition, and that's your hypothesis. Your ideas and your theory. This is what's going to explain how your research progresses from your original idea. And most research projects begin with an idea, with a question, something that the researcher wants to answer. Typically, the ideas, as we said, are your starting point for your research. The difficulty is finding a good idea for research. I know how many people struggle at this point within your research of what do I do it on? Well, you always should pick an idea, especially something that interests you. Don't pick something because you think someone else wants to read it. You really want to you want something that you can research. You don't want to pick an abstract idea that's going to be very difficult to support or to find any collaboration on. Many ideas are just derived from your observation. You might begin by observing what you will be doing within your project, observing a certain phenomenon or occurrence or people. And at that point, you might really get an idea from what you see of what you want to try to hypothesize within your research. Some of your ideas will derive from information that you've already learned, something, as I said, that you're interested in, something that piques your interest, something that you've seen before, and you want to really delve into that. As I talked about the difficult, some ideas are difficult to research. You might have uncooperative gatekeepers. You might have those that you're trying to reach out to that just really don't want to give you any information, or you might even find within qualitative research. This is one reason that qualitative research can be so time-consuming. You might start off interviewing, and you might realize the questions you're asking, or maybe they're just too invasive. Maybe they're too general, and you're just not getting into the person. And that's why it's important, what we're going to talk about later in the class, about your interviewing techniques and, really starting a conversation with someone. And, it's important then to record, because you want that person to trust you, and you want to build on that. So it can be difficult to really get into them. So after you have your idea, you might think, well, how do I incorporate this into a type of theory? Well, this is called the theory before research model, where you begin with the formal statements of ideas and theory, and really move into your research. It's the basis for most empirical research. It has conjectures, but also it refutes those. So you might go back and forth with really finding research that supports or non-supports your theory. So that's why it's called the theory before research model. Also, we have the research before theory model, and this is really when your theory is based off of some data that you've already collected. So the research really occurs before you develop your theory. And it occurs in the developing or testing of a theory. And what we're going to find throughout this class and in your textbook, that researchers really go back and forth between these two types of models. So you don't have to be stuck with just one. And this is called the spiraling approach. So it's a non-linear research model. So you really never leave any stage behind, and you continue to revisit your previous stages. Our next slide really shows us a figure of this spiraling research approach where, as I said, it's a nonlinear model, so you can proceed forward, but you can also spiral back. So you start your previous stages are revisited throughout your research. You have your, if you look at it, you have your ideas, theory. Well, you might go back to your idea. You might move on to your design, and at this point, you might actually jump to analysis. You might, from your design, you might go back to your theory. You could just go straight through design, data collection to analysis. Then you might, from your analysis, go to your dissemination. At dissemination, you might find yourself going back to analysis. Here, you might find yourself going back to the design. So this is just an idea of the different kinds of approaches. So next, we're talking about reviewing the literature. And this is always important. Whenever you have an idea, you really want to see what's already been done. And this is where you're going to develop your literature review. So you would begin with evaluating the websites. You would do a lot of internet searches. First and many times, this is the only method. You might use Google Scholar. You might, in books, you want document delivery versus repository. This is any time when you're in the LMU library, if you find an article that's not available, that you can't download, you can request it through Iliad. And I do this quite often. And it means that our librarians, which we are very thankful for, they will find that article and email it to you. Or, I think they put it in your Iliad account. So you just go back onto the library site and then you can download that article. So anytime you can't find a particular article in the LMU website library, do that. Request it that way. You want to look at considerations for web use, which whose website is it? It's really important to use peer-reviewed, empirically based. You don't want to use a websites that's just blogs. You need to know the nature of the domain of that site. You need to know how current it is, how dated the material is. Can the information be corroborated that you have found on that website? You also want to look at content versus use. So your suggestions for organizing your work, you want to break your work into different parts, put notes on the content, notes on the usage within your own work. I suggest highly that you make notes as you go, especially whenever I'm doing my own research and let's say I pull something from an article and it's just an idea that I've read in a paragraph. I will note that within my writings so I can put the name of the article and what page it's on. Because after you have done many revisions to your work, you might look at something and you have a quote or you have a citation. And you might reword that, thinking, well, that doesn't sound good. Let me reword that, what I've put there. Well, you might reword it back to the direct quote. So you've got to be real careful to make sure that you know where that came from, so you can always go back. And that when you have your literature, you might have every sentence in there might have a page number. That's okay. You're not going to leave it there, but that's just for your own notation. As I said, record your citation information on your writing notes. Identify the major claims, the subject matter. You want to record your quotes, definitions, and your findings, as I said. You want to compile in a file that you can is readily available to you. Also, that could be secure if you do it within a paper file. You print things off. You want to make sure that you know where it is and it's filed correctly. When you use your keywords for your literature researches, Your keywords really describe the content of the file, and so it allows for quick sorting and categorization. So when you're, this is when you're making your notes and you have keywords, you can go back and find things within your own notes. It also allows for an assessment of multiple authors within your work. Now you want to write your literature review. You want to dispel any myths that have come across, or any myths that you might have felt or believed. You want to explain competing conceptual frameworks. You want to clarify the focus of your own work, and you want to be able to justify any assumptions that you might make within your own ideas and within your own theory. Next, you'll be framing your research problems, your research questions. So your research problems should be direct or derived from your research studies, your research articles that you've completed. Your research questions really inform the research study, and their importance of framing the research questions. You want to use a suggested organization might be have your problem statement and then your research questions that are influenced by the literature. Next, as I talked about before, we are going to operationalize and conceptualize our ideas, our statements. So when you conceptualize your definitions, you're limiting the approach to a particular perspective. You're letting the readers know, and within your own research, exactly what is the limits of your concepts. It reveals and justifies specific kinds of data. Your operationalized definitions are, you want to be concrete in their intended meanings of your concepts. You want to make sure that you clearly define those. It provides criteria for your measurement of your concepts. And also you want to include examples. So you might have to put the weight, and that we'll talk about that really a little bit more on it within the class, but it's a really simple operationalizing is weighting. If you have to weight certain things a little bit heavier, and what I mean by that is you might have to adjust the importance of some concepts according to what you're doing within your own research. You want to look at the chronically ill quality of life. You want to have, which is more complex operationalizing. You also want to look at religiosity within your own examples. Also, within designing your project, you want to make a concept map, and you're going to see this, I can't remember what unit it's in, but you'll be building your own concept mapping. And this concept mapping is a research tool, and it can assist within your own research design. It can clarify any confusions that are there, and it also enables better understanding of the relationships. The Joseph Novick and his colleagues from Cornell University in the 70s are the originators of the concept mapping. It features things like a flow chart, nodes, lines, and labels. There's an example here in a few minutes. It also features propositions, which are the elements of the meaning of your concepts. So, how do you create this concept map? Well, you want to list concepts on one page, rearrange from the abstract to the specific, organize your ideas to related ideas, put those that are like together, draw lines from the broad concepts to your more specific concepts. Your next step is to make a sense of clusters or connections. Remember, talked about that, about what the ideas are in your theories. There are those clusters, and how they're connected. You want to separately describe examples and illustrations. Reorganize for visually apparent relationships. So when you start off doing your concept mapping, it's just like doing any research or any outline. You're going to make changes to it as you go. And then you want to refine all of your steps that you have within your concept mapping. So now let's look at an example of a concept map. This pertains to social and health professional perceptions of obese teens. So take a minute and look over this. You know, you've got your obesity and perceptions. You include your concept categories. You have clusters of ideas that are within your categories. And you have connection lines between the concepts. So when you have here's your obese teen, you know, they're observed. You might have your health professional perceptions, the social perceptions, the social perceptions of interactions. You look at your recommendations, and from that you might have your potential policy that also includes that came from your recommendations. So anyway, this is just it's like a flow chart, but it's a map of your ideas. It's a map of your concept. And as I said, you will be doing this later on within the term. Now, the next part of designing your project is, as I said, you're using a concept map. So the benefits of really using this is you're seeing a series of relationships, you're seeing a series of processes, you're seeing the concrete statements, your testable propositions, your hypotheses, and you're theorizing and predicting what you're going to see as you conduct your research. Another point that's important to the concept map is the technical use within your research design. So data needs to be measured, needs to be able to be measured. You need to have your variables and your relationships that coincide. Now remember, you still have variables and relationships within qualitative research, but you're not quantifying them. So there's a difference here. Also, you want to look at setting and your population appropriateness. The features of the study or the site and setting could be, you want to choose a place that's reasonable in size, not too complex. Entry or access possible. So you don't want some place that you're observing that you might have to have a code or a pass to get into. You want appropriate people available to observe, to interview. Your studies focuses people in the programs that are available within your observation spectrum. Research able to be conducted effectively. These are these ideas that you really need to look at prior to choosing your idea, your theory, before choosing where you want to conduct your research. Also, you need to make a decision to use a research site. So you need to be able to access to the appropriate population, and it's not merely accessible population, but you really want, you may have to request permission to speak to someone. You also, within your qualitative study, you would need to get consent forms signed by those that you interview. And so, but you don't necessarily want that is just accessible. You want something, you really want to delve into it, just depending on what your focus is. The next item that you need to consider is your setting and population appropriateness. You want to have your sampling to make inferences. You want to be able to infer between what you're locating. Your sample needs to be very representation of the larger population. You might you would use probability sampling, a simple random sample, or even non-probability samples. So you need to determine this prior to. This is all part of your design within your qualitative study. Another point you want to think about are convenience samples, and this really relies on available subjects. They're used frequently, associated risks between them, and it's quick and inexpensive. This is something that you really want to concentrate on for this project because you don't have an extensive amount of time. If you use purposeful samples, researchers use expertise to select these type of samples. It lacks, though, a wide generalizability, and it can be profitable to use. You could use snowball samples. Which is similar to convenience sampling. This is when you might talk to one person who would then recommend you talk to someone else. So you're going to build upon the samples that you begin with. You would identify subjects with relevant characteristics, and as I said, subjects will refer others within the similar characteristics. Quota samples is another way to go. This begins with a matrix that creating strata or cells, and the attributes are associated with each stratum. Also, too, as I mentioned earlier, that you can use non-probability method. This part that we're talking about within designing our project is using your concept map that you've created. So you want to look at the demographics. Useful if they factor into the result. In some studies cause natural stratification, but it's not always useful. Also, you want to determine the representativeness. Your research question is important determiner of the representative of your sample, and you not necessarily have your concept mapping is not for your demographics. When you do begin to collect your data and organize it, there's two important points. Data considerations. You need to decide how you're going to collect it and keep it. Are you going to use cassette tapes, notebooks, photos, your phone? But so you want to use something that's reliable and that you could store as necessary. You need to determine how to prepare your data for analysis after you've collected it. These are some things, these are just what you need to consider while you're collecting your data. Also, you want to make sure and organize your data. You want to organize between any quantitative you might have and qualitative data. And what I'm saying is on this, let's say that you're examining, this is very simple, you're examining the number of, or the types of cars that stop at a specific stop sign between 1 and 2 o'clock on Tuesday. And so you might be taking in the color of the car, the type of the car, if you could see how many people are in the car, who's driving the car. Those are all your qualitative, but you also might include how many people actually stopped at the stopped at the stop sign, and how many red cars stopped at the stop sign. That's where it becomes more quantified. Your organization can depend on your data format. Like I said, these are the things you really need to be thinking about before you collect your data. You know, what kind of format are you going to put them in? Are you going to use a table? Are you just going to write on a yellow pad? Pre-analysis work is needed. As I said, you need to prepare for this prior to actually going out and collecting your data. You might actually even just want to do a trial run. You might want to go out wherever you're going, whatever you're going to collect, and observe or interview or talk to people. You might just want to do a trial run and see, notify the discrepancies, the weaknesses within what your ideas are, and then improve on that. Also, it's important to think about where you're going to store your data, how you're going to retrieve it, and then, of course, how you're going to analyze it. Your data reduction is data is reduced and transformed or coded if you're going to be using even within a qualitative. And when I talk about coding, is you want to compare the different participants within your study, and so you might just it's depending on how you're going to analyze it. So let's say you've interviewed offenders and you're wondering how many came, what kind of homes they came from, where did they grow up, what kind of environment, what kind of community. So if you've interviewed 10 offenders and they all have some of the similar ideas, you want to really code those so that when you look at them better, you can be able to, when you start to report your data, that you can look at how many said this and how many said that, and that way you can easily retrieve it. Your data reduction enables more accessibility and understanding of your data. The data reduction directs attention to what's important. It also creates more manageable data. Your data display, it's how you organize and compress the assembly of the information that you have. You want to use tables, tally sheets, pictures, summaries, and other areas that you identify that you think are important ways in order to display your data. Display actually helps the reader's understanding. And when you're looking at qualitative, if you're looking at interviews and you're really reporting what people said, you may not necessarily put them in tables, but you may organize according to the questions that you asked. You might organize according to how it approaches your theory. You might organize them according to the problems that it identified, or even according to their answers. And this is all in how you're going to report your findings within your analysis area within your study. Again, your data display, it's leaves definitive conclusions. Researchers can remain open-minded and skeptical. Conclusions emerge after your data reduction and after your display. You want to verify your data so that your expectations are supported by the data. You want twofold consideration. One, conclusions must be confirmed, and procedures are used are clearly articulated. In other words, you're defining and clearly organizing and explaining the expectations that you received from the data, and even maybe that wasn't supported by the data. The next, really the last section within your research study will be the dissemination. So on completion of your research project, after you have collected all your data, you have displayed it, you've organized it, you've compared it, you've analyzed it, at this point, your study's not really over yet, because you have to disseminate in order to benefit others. Also, you want, within your dissemination, you want reports submitted, you want your formal presentations, you might even, at this point, publish your report, and then at this point, after you have done all of this, it's disseminated it, you've got your discussion section, you've analyzed it, you're done, your project can now be complete. So let's look now at why it works. Because of the measures that you've identified and used. If it's set up well, then their measures will equal your discoveries. You can relate now to the concepts. Your concepts have relationships to one another within your project, and these relationships that you have noticed and observed and documented, they now have led to the patterns that which you were expecting or not expecting, or didn't even know what to expect. Remember, the patterns are what you're looking for within social sciences qualitative research. Also, the logic of your research design is important to why it works. It tells how and why the research worked. You truly conceptualized and operationalized everything. It was clear that met up with what you were measuring, that met up with your patterns. Also, the previous research that you conducted actually led to your testable predictions or your hypothesis. Now, why it fails? There's many reasons why a research project like this can fail, more than just what we're going to talk about here. Your expectations, you need to be aware of your expectations and your preferences. You need to try to be within your qualitative research. Be open-minded. Don't try to just support what you think. Try to take in everything that you see and then go back and look at why of what you thought. So, but if you really are closed-minded and try to follow your expectation, your research can fail. It's primed for confirmation bias, as I said. Anytime, and this is what's really important about qualitative research and why I suggested this, it's very important when conducting qualitative research to have more than just one researcher, so that each researcher interviews and observes the same information, and then they compare. And because if you have a bias towards anything within your research, then you might try to confirm what you believe or disprove what you don't believe. So that's why it's important. That's why I had said in the beginning, if you have somebody you wanted to do your research with, you're welcome to do that. I know it's a little bit more difficult when you're working online, but I did mention this before, that even if you're in different cities and you want to research the same type of information, you can do it and then compare those two areas with where you research. Also, within our expectations, it's harder to imagine unexpected data, so that's why you want to be clearly open-minded. Some other reasons for failure: your concepts could have been poorly understood, explained, measured, and used. You weren't clear within your conceptualization. You may have gotten data from inappropriate samples. Your reality was changing faster than the research methods. You didn't, as the elements and the patterns were changing, or as reality changes, you didn't alter your research methods and alter what you needed to do. Remember, this is why I said it was so important that when you're conducting a conversation, that you feed off of what the person says and you don't just go with what questions you have. Questions may arise within what you hear someone say. And that's why it's important to be able to change as you see your data change with the reality. And also, too, another reason that all of the parts just don't line up within your study. These are things that you really need to recognize when you're conducting this research. If you have any questions on this, if there's anything I'm not clear on, you want me to talk about further detail, please shoot that into the virtual office, and I'd be more than happy to do that.